They say the road has a way of changing a man. But what if I told you that the real journey isn't about where you go, but who you become? I left everything behind: my job, my routine, my so-called perfect life, and hit the open road. What I learned along the way? It changed me forever. This is my story. The highway stretched endlessly in both directions, a silver ribbon cutting through fields of golden wheat and misty forests. The wind carried the scent of rain, and the sky threatened to burst open with a summer storm. A lone traveler, Jack Reynolds, drove steadily down the road, his hands firm on the wheel of his old Ford pickup. The back of the truck held only a few essentials: a sleeping bag, a worn backpack, and a battered journal filled with half-finished thoughts. Jack wasn't running away from anything. He just wasn't sure what he was running toward. For years, he had lived the life everyone expected of him. A 9-to-5 job in a corporate office in Chicago, a small apartment with a skyline view, Friday nights spent drinking with the same group of friends, talking about the same things. He had built a good life, but it felt hollow. Every morning, he woke up feeling like he was watching his own life happen from the outside. And so, one day, he packed up his truck, withdrew his savings, and hit the open road. Lesson 1. The map is not the territory. Jack had started with a carefully planned route: Chicago to Yellowstone, then down to Arizona, across to California, and back. But he quickly learned that maps were just guidelines. Plans changed, roads closed. Strangers invited him to places he hadn't intended to go. One evening, in a small roadside diner just outside of Missouri, Jack met Gus, an old trucker with decades of road experience. Gus sat across from him in the booth, stirring sugar into his coffee. "You got a route planned?" Gus asked. Jack nodded. "Yeah, I mapped everything out before I left." Gus chuckled, shaking his head. "Son, the map is not the territory. Plans are fine, but they ain't the road. The road's got a mind of its own. You gotta learn to follow it, not control it." That night, Jack thought about Gus's words as he drove through the open countryside, fireflies flickering like tiny stars along the road. The best experiences weren't the ones he planned. They were the ones he let happen. Lesson 2. Comfort is a cage. In Colorado, Jack parked his truck near a mountain trail and decided to hike to the summit. The first few miles were easy, but as the trail steepened, his legs burned and sweat soaked through his shirt. He thought about turning back. Maybe he should be at a cozy motel, watching TV with air conditioning instead of struggling up a rocky path. At the peak, he met a mountain guide named Elena, a woman in her 50s who had been climbing the Rockies her whole life. She sat on a rock, sipping from a metal flask, watching the sunset. Jack dropped onto the ground beside her, gasping. "This was harder than I thought." Elena smirked. "Good. If it were easy, everyone would do it." Jack wiped his forehead. "Sometimes I think I should just go back to my old life. It was comfortable." Elena took a deep breath and looked out over the endless stretch of mountains. Comfort is a cage. You don't notice it until you try to leave. But once you do, you'll never fit inside it again. Jack nodded. She was right. And as he watched the sky burn orange and pink, he knew he wouldn't be going back just yet. Lesson 3. People make the journey. A few weeks later, Jack found himself in Austin, Texas, drawn in by the sound of live blues music from a bar on 6th Street. Inside, a man with salt and pepper hair played an old Fender guitar, his voice rough but soulful. Jack sat at the bar listening when the musician took a break and joined him. "You're not from around here," the man said. "Nope, just passing through." The musician grinned. "Then you already know the truth. What we remember most from the road ain't the places. It's the people." It was true. When Jack thought back on his journey, it wasn't the mountains or highways that stood out. It was Gus in Missouri, Elena in Colorado, and now this old musician in Texas. It was the kindness of strangers, the laughter shared over coffee in diners, the late-night conversations with people he might never see again. No matter how far he wandered, he was never truly alone. Lesson 4. Money comes and goes. Time only goes. By the time Jack reached California, his savings were running low. He thought about turning back. Maybe it was time to find another job, settle down again. One afternoon, he stopped at a gas station in Big Sur and struck up a conversation with an old fisherman named Marty, who had been living off the coast for 30 years. Marty leaned against his truck, watching the waves crash against the cliffs. "You're worried about money, aren't you?" Jack exhaled. "Yeah, I've been on the road for months, and I don't know how much longer I can keep going." Marty smirked. "Listen, kid, money comes and goes. Time only goes. You can make more money later. You can't make more time." Jack stared out at the ocean, letting those words sink in. He wasn't just spending money, he was spending time, something he could never get back. That night, instead of planning his way home, he sat on the beach and watched the sunset, knowing he wasn't done traveling yet. Lesson 5. You can never go back, only forward. Months later, when Jack finally returned to Chicago, everything was exactly the same. The streets, the buildings, the people rushing to work. But something was different. Him. The office where he once worked now felt suffocating. The conversations he used to have now seemed meaningless. He had seen too much, lived too much, to return to his old life. One evening, he met up with an old friend for drinks. "So, when are you settling down?" his friend asked. Jack smiled, shaking his head. He understood now. Settling down wasn't about staying in one place. It was about being at peace with movement, with change. "I am settled," Jack said. "I just move a little more than most." And the next morning, he packed up his truck once again. The road was calling. Final lesson. The journey never ends. Years passed. Jack kept wandering. His beard grew longer, his journal thicker. He traveled to Alaska, where he learned patience from old hunters. He lived with musicians in New Orleans, learning that some stories can only be told through music. He hiked the Scottish Highlands, learning that sometimes the journey was worth more than the destination. One day, sitting at a campfire in Oregon, a young traveler asked him, "How do you know when the journey is over?" Jack smiled. "It isn't," he said. "You just learn to carry it with you." And under a sky full of stars, the road stretched endlessly before him. Because in the end, we are all nomads. Some just choose to wander,